Since the dawn of democracy, the ANC-led government has been advocating for a pro-Palestinian stance towards the ongoing conflict between the two Middle Eastern states of Israel and Palestine. The government continues to call for a two-state solution and the end to the Palestinian occupation. In the process, it continues to condemn attacks on Palestinians and support action aimed at isolating the state of Israel. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Aldrin St. Pierre. Well, quite recently, a number of events have been taking place, including the downgrade of the Israeli embassy. The Arts and Culture Department has also applauded the South African Rugby Union's withdrawal of the invitation to an Israeli team and has previously put pressure on various parties who sought to ply their trade in Israel. Yet the South African government continues to have trade relations with the state of Israel, totaling at about 6 billion rands in the past financial year. How do ordinary South Africans understand this behavior, which seems to border on duplicity? Tonight we ask, is South Africa's behavior towards Israel hypocritical? Joining us for this conversation this evening, we have Pamela Ngubane, who is the South African Friends of Israel spokesperson. Also, Dr. Philani Mthembu, Executive Director for the Institute for Global Dialogue, is joining us for this conversation. And via Zoom, we are joined by Zain Dengo, who is the Director General at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Remember that you can also be part of this conversation via our social media platforms. That is at Unfiltered Unfiltered SABC on Twitter, and on Facebook just search for Unfiltered SABC. So before we start the conversation, let's just take a quick listen to what the then Minister of DIRCO, that is Lindiwe Sisulu, had to say last year during an interview that she had with my colleague Mzwandile Mbeje about the decision to downgrade the Israeli embassy. Remember that this was also part of a 2017 decision that was taken by the ANC at its conference. Just take a listen quickly.
Stood up to say that was our resolution. We confirmed it in conference. Yeah. The Israeli representatives in the country felt very aggrieved. They made the grievances very known. I was very publicly humiliated in their newspapers. It was a public matter. Everybody could see. And I would have expected that he would say, look, this is my minister, and I am going to protect the resolutions of government, of the NEC conference. I was left dangling alone. And it wasn't just the president, the whole of the ANC. Yeah. I don't remember that the ANC stood up and said that was our resolution that the minister is carrying through.
Okay, and let's start off this conversation speaking to the DG of DIRCO. DG, thank you so much for making time for us. Just a quick response to what Minister Lindiwe Sisulu had to say there about her experience after that decision was taken to downgrade the embassy. I know that you only joined in 2022 as DG. However, though, when you came in, did you get a sense at all that there seems to be some sort of, conflict around the decision that was taken by the ANC, the resolution of the ANC to downgrade the status of the Israeli embassy or the South African embassy in Israel?
Eldon, I think, the decision to downgrade did stem from a governing party resolution that asked the government to downgrade. The withdrawal of our ambassador at that time by then Minister Sisulu was in line with the decision of the governing party. I do know that with any kind of decision like this, there'll be differences of opinion, but I don't think that it was one that I think that my own recollection is that within the governing party, the decision was generally supported. And the decision by the then minister to withdraw the ambassador from Tel Aviv enjoyed support from most of the governing party leadership. It's not something for me to comment on in terms of what happened in the ANC, but just my recollection is that it was generally well supported.
It was generally well supported. Dr. Mthembu, what's your take on what the minister had to say there?
Well, I think it's one thing, obviously, to downgrade. I think the debate is around the implications of it. Obviously, there was support for it. within the governing party. Government then, as the DG said, did withdraw our ambassador. And I think the key thing there, and going back to your question, is about the message that South Africa is basically communicating, I guess, to the international community. Essentially what South Africa, I think, was saying, and there's been a robust engagement not only in South Africa but around the world, is on what further actions should be taken to actually, not to isolate necessarily the state of Israel, but to send a message around supporting the two-state solution. I think there's a number of initiatives that have happened in the last few years.
Yeah.
Whether from the US and others.
But what else is available to our government? Because our government has already registered their opposition to the stance that has been taken by Israel.
Exactly, and I think the point has been made. The question now is that the fact that Israel obviously is continuing on I would say a diplomatic offensive on the African continent. I mean, you've seen that within the African Union, this has become quite a contentious issue, where there was essentially the decision to give Israel an observer status within the African Union. South Africa opposed it, along with other countries within Southern Africa and in others. So the debate now is what further actions, following the downgrade, would actually be taken not only by South Africa, but also by the African countries. And I think that is where the debate is, and around the effectiveness of the decision in terms of sending the message to Israel and the international community, but also in terms of South Africa maintaining a certain degree of diplomatic tools where it can actually encounter Israel on the continent.
DG, just quickly, do you think that there are more tools available to the South African government over and above what the South African government has already done? And also considering that some people argue that the South African government's approach to Israel seems to be hypocritical because we still have the trade relation between the two countries.
So just on the last part, I don't think, the trade relation is because we haven't yet come to the point where we've agreed on a total isolation, economic, including economic boycotts from a state-to-state level. We do see that certain elements of private individuals, universities and others have taken the route of delinking. One must always, Eldrin, look at why is South Africa taking the stance. We're looking at a state since 1948, that has, through successive governments, imposed a system that many critics, including some reputable legal scholars, some of the best international scholars are now calling an apartheid system. This is something that NGOs in the occupied territories have been writing for a long time about, but it's only gaining traction now that some of the bigger international NGOs, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others are talking about this contravention of the crime of apartheid. So you combine that with an occupation and increased settlements, it means that given our history, where we've come from as South Africa and countries like Namibia, we have to take steps to show our dissatisfaction with this kind of differential treatment oppression based on the same kinds of policies. Some even argue worse than what we experience. Deprivation from land, fragmentation of people through domains of control. So the withdrawal of our ambassador, the statements we make at the UN is the minimum that we could do in a situation where we don't have a seat at the table. So there's much more that we can do, but what we can do is highlight what the nature of the oppression is and ask for the world to take some action.
All right, we're going to deal with some of those, but just quickly then, on this decision that has been taken by SARU to revoke the invitation to the Tel Aviv Heat to be part of the Mzansi Challenge that's taking place next month, was that an influence from the state? Did the state try to influence SARU at all?
Alberto, we did not even engage with SARU. The major pressure for this decision came from civil society in South Africa. And I think that's where the major pressure came from. And, maybe some of the other panelists can talk about that. But, from our side, we did not even engage with the Department of Arts and Culture or with SARU.
Yeah.
So the pressure really came from civil society.
Okay, so when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation and also going to be hearing from Pamela Ngubeni, who is the South African Friends of Israel spokesperson around this decision that has been taken by SARU. And of course, SARU had said that they've received several inputs from various stakeholders with regard to their decision to invite the Tel Aviv Heat to perform, or rather to play, in the Mzansi Challenge, which takes place next month. Of course, this is not the first time that we've seen something like this. And of course, the South African Arts and Culture Department welcoming this decision. Remember what happened in 2021 when Lalela Mswana was supposed to go to Israel for Miss Universe? It was the South African government again that said, don't go. She defied that. But that was because this is a company. Miss South Africa is a company. So why should certain companies not be allowed to trade with Israel where others can? That conversation when we come back. Well, we're asking you this evening, do you believe that South Africa's government stance on Israel is hypocritical? Remember, you can tweet at Unfiltered SABC and also find us on Facebook at Unfiltered SABC. Pamela Ngubeni, let's hear from you. What's your take on this decision that SARU has taken?
SARU's decision sounds like it was taken after the president of SARU received death threats for allowing the Tel Aviv Heat to participate in the Mzansi Challenge. It doesn't sound like he interacted with all stakeholders. For example, South African Friends of Israel was not invited to engage on the matter. Neither were the Jewish Board of Deputies or the South African Zionist Federation. And the Tel Aviv Heat themselves say they were not engaged with, nor the Israel Rugby Union. So it sounds like he took this decision based on fear that his life would be threatened by anti-Israel elements who cannot countenance the idea of an Israeli rugby team coming here.
The death threats?
This is the report where he was quoted saying he received death threats.
Mm-hmm. And based on these death threats, where do you think they are emanating from?
It sounds like they're emanating from BDS quarters. We're not sure, but essentially it's anti-Israel elements who are not interested in allowing an Israeli rugby team on South African soil. As South African Friends of Israel, we think the reason why this is happening is because if you look at the demographics of the Tel Aviv Heat, it is multiracial, multicultural, and multi-ethnic. When a team like that from Israel comes to South Africa, it puts paid to the lie that Israel is an apartheid state. You would never have seen a rugby team like that during apartheid in South Africa. Israel is a multicultural, multinational, multi-ethnic democracy that embraces all of its citizens. It's in the founding charters of the State of Israel.
So you don't believe that Israel is an apartheid state, even though there's these resolutions by the United Nations, 1948, 1969 as well?
Israel is not an apartheid state because an apartheid state is a state that discriminates against people based on ethnicity or race. Israel doesn't do that. It has Arabs in its civil structures, it's got Arabs in its hospitals, in its schools, it's got Arabs in its Supreme Court, in command posts in the IDF. An apartheid state would be one that systematically oppressed the Arab population of Israel to the supremacy aspirations of the Jewish population. The Jewish population of Israel itself interacts freely with the Arab population. They're marrying each other. What's going on in Israel is that they have to defend themselves against terrorism. By no means saying that the Palestinian society is beset by terrorism. There are small elements, just like this small element in South Africa that sent the death threats to the SARU president. Same thing is happening. Small elements are allowing a situation where it appears that...
And what's your interpretation of the occupation?
It's not an occupation. An occupation is an international relations term, which would suggest that in the West Bank, there was a sovereign that used to occupy that territory and that Israel took that land from that sovereign. That's not what's happened in the West Bank. It's a territorial dispute. If there's any sovereign we could discuss, it would have to be the state of Jordan.
Okay. DG, just quickly on what Pamela is saying now, on the definition of occupation, How would you interpret South Africa's stance around the two-state solution then?
So let's just step back a bit. Occupation is not an accusation. Occupation is a state of fact. And it's, the ICJ, in the whole opinion, again, reaffirmed the nature of the occupation. So, just like with Morocco and Western Sahara, it's not an allegation, it's a legal statement of fact. There's also the narrative, I think, that Pamela is talking about a land without a people for a land with a people, which justifies the kind of colonialism that took place under land grabs. And I think that, we must actually just look at where that comes from. It's a fiction. So when we talk about an apartheid state, we're talking about leading international scholars, including Israeli scholars, like Michael Sfard, B'Tselem. We've met with them, and they've been writing about this as well. So Israeli NGOs too recognize that the system of apartheid and systemic discrimination is taking place. Separation of people, not only through walls, but through roads.
Well, the argument from Israel,
the
argument from Israel has continuously been, and this has now happened about 2 weeks ago as well, where, as Pamela has pointed out as well, is that they're defending themselves against terrorists.
Yeah, so, the right of Israel to defend itself as an occupying power is circumscribed by the laws of occupation. There's certain things that they can do to defend citizens against violent extremists, but essentially, if one looks at the nature of the systemic violence, it's one, you have a powerful country with a powerful military and a powerful police taking on people who are largely unarmed, living in the equivalent of Bantustans that are fenced off and walled off with very little power of their own. So that notion of killing children, killing lots of innocent people in the name of self-defense is one that doesn't wash anymore. I think since the level of fatalities since January this year is already double what you found last year, in the similar period. So what we're seeing is an escalation of the kinds of indiscriminate targeting of innocent Palestinians. And I think this is where the South African government has taken a stance, because this particular, government in power now, and Pamela should be able to comment on this, that I have people that in Israel itself were classified as being terrorist groupings are now part of the Knesset and part of the government.
Let's get Pamela to respond to that quickly.
I think we need to have a more discussion on this.
Pamela, quick response to that.
It's very interesting that the South African government is willing to engage with Russia and try to understand why Russia is assaulting Ukraine. Where 6,000 people have died, and in that same period where 6,000 people have died, between 170 and 200 people have died in the Palestinian territories during firefights with the Israeli army. South Africa needs to take a dehyphenated approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Let us deal with Israel and the Palestinians as separate entities, just like we deal with Russia and Ukraine as separate entities, just how we deal with Iran and the protesters that are being clamped down on as separate entities. Taking this approach that Israel is constantly going to be defined based on its relationship with the Palestinians, so that we're never going to reach a point where we can actually engage with Israel on its merits. Why is Israel having to defend itself? Why is the IDF having to go into Jenin and crack down on terror cells? Why is it having to shoot down rocket manufacturing plants in the Gaza Strip? It's because it is beset by hostile actors on both sides who want to annihilate its people and its statehood.
So when we come back, we're going to get some closing remarks and also hear from Dr. Mthembu what his take is on what has been said this evening. Remember, we're also taking your comments at Unfiltered SABC on Twitter and Unfiltered SABC on Facebook. And welcome back. Let's get some closing remarks from our panel this evening. Pamela, let's start off with you. What happens next for Safi?
Safi has asked Saru to tell us how it is that they came to the decision to exclude the Tel Aviv Heat from the Mzansi Challenge. They have until close of business on Wednesday to let us know who they actually consulted and how they came to this decision by providing us minutes of meetings. And if they fail to do so, we're going to be approaching them with a PIA application to seek a legal recourse as to how it is they came to this conclusion, because they have discriminated against this team because it's from Israel. There's no reason why they had to exclude the Tel Aviv Heat. They're not oppressing anyone. They're not rigging the game of rugby. It's a team that is registered with World Rugby, IOC. It's a reputable organization, and it would have given the people of South Africa a chance to experience
And now this matters
Israel.
before the World Rugby as well.
The World Rugby has been approached by a barrister from New Zealand to engage with them and to ask them to investigate SARU, because the barrister says SARU has breached the World Rugby Code of Conduct by excluding the Tel Aviv Heat for no reason.
Okay. Dr. Mthembu, some closing remarks from you, and also taking into consideration what Pamela just had to say.
I think, the challenge here is that the longer this conflict continues, is the more hardened the different positions become. We're in a situation where there's agreement broadly that the current government in Israel is probably the most conservative right-wing in the history of the state. And I think the longer this conflict continues, it makes it difficult, and therefore the position that South Africa has taken, it's about having downgraded the embassy. What does it do on the African continent to actually communicate its message? And I think this is really what we're going to be evaluating with time, the diplomatic tools at its disposal. So the government cannot interfere on certain things that civil society actors are doing and that the private sector is doing.
Okay.
So I think this is what we're going to have to keep our eye on.
DG, just quickly closing remarks on your end. I know the minister earlier on today as well, when she was meeting with a counterpart from Algeria, said that South Africa will continue to register its opposition to Israel being granted observer status at the African Union.
Yes. This issue, I'm in Addis Ababa at the moment. This issue will most likely be up for discussion at some point. And the reason why we take these stances is that we to continuously register the fact that it is an abnormal situation. The occupation is abnormal. It's been going on for 75 years. The two-state solution is in real danger because the settlement patterns through a fait accompli, where more and more settlements into what was the Palestinian sections of the then Green Line is in many cases rendered a viable two-state solution very, very difficult to achieve.
Okay.
But what we will do is to continue to mobilize for the human rights of all on both sides of the Green Line to be respected. And hopefully this will be done quite sooner rather than later through genuine talks based on the prevailing international legal instruments.
Is Pamela right, DG, to make the comparison between the stance that South Africa is taking on Israel-Palestine versus the stance that South Africa is taking on Russia-Ukraine?
Not really. Let's look at it this way. So you have one where you have an occupation for over 75 years. Russia-Ukraine is a war that is between two countries. It's ultimately that that both of them arose out of the then Soviet Union, and that's where territorial issues come into play.
But one did invade the other.
We have registered our and we're saying that the use of force by Russia is unlawful, and our statement has also said that we cannot condone the taking of land through force. And we've made that statement at the UN. It's exactly the same position that we hold in relation to the taking of annexation of land through the use of force in Israel. And
unfortunately, we've come to end, DG. I would have really loved to continue this conversation, especially what Pamela is pointing out, the hypocrisy, some would argue even. But we've come to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening on Unfiltered. We're back again next week, Monday, same time, same place, right here on S3. Tot ziens. Enjoy the rest of your evening.